It was spring. Spring was springing. Leaves were bursting out of buds, flowers were shooting up out of meadows and verges, and trees and shrubs were blooming. And people were feeling buoyed, revelling in that increased daylight and warmth that spring brings, bringing with it increased optimism that things were gonna be okay, or at least more manageable than they had been in the dark cold of winter. But suddenly, it began to snow. Or rather, it didn't, but tiny little ice crystals began forming in the air. You could almost hear them form. A tiny, tiny little creaking, but amplified by the sheer quantity of them. This strange, creaking, unimaginably cold ice began to cover everything, and the sky darkened, and the earlier tweeting and twittering of the spring birds was replaced by a darker, slower calling of the crows which wheeled around. And people looked out of their doors and windows and saw the brick and stone of the buildings around town slowly getting covered, encrusted in this ice. And as they looked up and out, the crows settled on the icy rooftops. And the chaotic calling of the crows cawing became more rhythmic, until they were all calling in unison, seeming to breathe in and out with each slow croak. Rock, rock, rock. And in the darkening skies, suddenly the ice stopped forming and everything grew still. And what little light made it through the dark sky glinted off the ice, shimmering like sharpened shards of steel. And from the bottom of the hill that led up to the town centre came a cacophony, a terrible, loud, intense sound, like the creaking of all the world's glaciers over their entire lifespan, but condensed into one tiny, tiny single moment of seemingly never-ending time. And a thing had appeared there. In the swirling of the darkness, the groaning of the ice, and the cawing of the crows, it was impossible to see really what form this thing had. It was an amorphous force of snow and ice. Nothing like the light, fluffy snow of winter, which occasionally fell in sufficient quantities for the townspeople to grab their sledges if they had them, or tea trays and fertiliser sacks, anything they could use to slide happily downhill in the soft snow. This was a dark, malevolent ice, the kind that slowly and unstoppably crushes ships. And this thing approached town without seeming to move, but inexorably, inevitably approaching with the force of a mighty glacier. It slipped, it creaked, it inveigled its way into the town centre. There was something of a standoff. Those townsfolk that hadn't taken shelter or hadn't been caught up in the crush of this ice beast stood firmly, if stiffly, in their ice-encrusted coats, terrified of this mysterious beast, but protective of their homes, their town and their friends. One of them stepped forward, a plucky young woman called Jack. She was the latest in a long line of children who had all grown up to be charming, warm-hearted, but formidable adults. They hadn't all been called Jack, but she gathered it was something of a family tradition. They had an amazing collection of family heirlooms, these strange, bizarre objects from all over the place, and each of them carried with it a miraculous and marvellous tale, all of them true. And Jack hoped fervently that whatever happened next would become the next story, ideally with her alive as the one to be doing the telling of it. So she stepped forward. "What do you want?" she said. As if in answer, with a groaning, with a creaking, with a yawing of ice, the thing expanded. It crushed a number of neighbouring buildings in the process. "That wasn't very nice," said Jack. The atmosphere changed. Nobody could quite put their finger on how they knew, but it was clear that the thing did not like Jack's attitude. "What are you going to do about it?" she said. "Come and get me." Now, shortly before the thing had reached the town centre, while others were panicking, Jack had nipped into the nearby hardware store, which sat just on the edge of the town centre, and picked something up. And all this time she had been holding it behind her back, and now she clicked a button on its handle and brandished it in front of her, revealing a fierce blowtorch. She wielded it at the ice beast, scoring a tiny little slice in its nether regions. And of course, it refroze in an instant. It caused no harm to the ice beast, but it did make it angry. It slid, it creaked, it groaned towards Jack. She danced around it, quick on her feet, sliding a little on the ice. If only she had picked up some ice grips in the hardware shop as well as the blowtorch. But she managed to remain standing. And now, while Jack's ancestors had mostly been lone workers, Jack had learned the art of collaboration and the benefit of teamwork. So she had made preparations, and some friends of hers had readied things. And as she danced around and taunted the ice beast, jabbing at it with her little blowtorch and saying, "You're just a big, brutish ice slug," she drew it nearer and nearer to a corner in the road where conveniently there was a large store of road salt. And on one side of this stood a brewery, and on the other side of this a foundry. And Jack was nimble, Jack was quick and oh so clever, and she nipped around the side of the salt mountain, leapt into the doorway of the foundry and shouted, "Now!" at the top of her lungs. And now one of her friends up in the brewery, who had been hastily rerouting pipework, pulled on a lever and let flow gallons upon gallons upon gallons of nearly boiling liquid from the mash tanks, and out it flowed into the mountain of salt. And in the foundry, other friends of Jack's had been getting things ready, as now she leapt up onto a gantry, pulled another lever and let flow tons upon tons of white-hot molten metal. And now the boiling water, the molten metal and the salt met in the middle with fairly explosive conditions. Steam and fragments of shrapnel sending little pieces of sharpened shards of metal still glowing and slicing at the ice beast, which began to break up into smaller and smaller pieces of ice, icebergs floating in the mass of salty molten water, salty water and molten metal and hardening and flying shards and steam. And these icebergs became smaller and smaller and melted down, until finally there was just a flood which swept off down the road into the tidal river and out to sea. And with this, all the remaining ice in the town melted and floated off and away. Whew. Jack stepped off her gantry, out into the yard, breathed a big sigh of relief and said, "Phew!" And then she spotted on the ground a particularly interestingly shaped shard of strange encrusted salt-bubbled metal. She picked it up, took it home to add to the family collection.